Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. I'm here at my central setup again, back somewhere in the state of Texas, so you can hear my better quality mic. I'm at the, I'm in the World War Now bunker, funded and supported, of course, by you, the audience, here with another week of World War III analysis. Good to be back stateside, back in the land of the free, the home of the brave, the United States of America. Noticeably gayer and browner than where I came from, but it's home nonetheless, right? So we're good to be back covering the ongoing Third World War with some very, very major developments. Of course, the Gaza peace deal has been signed. Phase 1 has begun. We've seen major Israeli withdrawals from Gaza City. We're going to be discussing the deal that was signed in Cairo, the Qatari, Egyptian, Turkish, and United States delegations, what's been going on, and the latest announcements from Hamas, from Israel about who exactly will be governing the Gaza Strip and the future of Palestine, the future of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and all of these places, as well as, of course, the escalating, impending new war, I believe, between Israel and Iran, as Iran fully divorces itself from the IAEA, as Israel says that Iran is preparing for another strike on them. Of course, we're going to discuss strikes on Lebanon, strikes in Syria, the escalating war between the United States and Venezuela, where it appears that actual physical strikes on Venezuelan soil and potential even ground operations are very much on the table for the United States, and Marco Rubio in particular in his neocon wing of the State Department. We're going to be discussing the future of all of that, how Russia, Iran, and China will be affected, as they are, of course, close allies of Venezuela. Then we're, of course, going to break down the front line in Russia, Ukraine, as Russia continues to advance, claiming 5,000 square kilometers have been taken from Ukraine since the beginning of 2025. So we're going to be discussing all of that, Ukraine's new strikes on civilians in Donetsk and Gorlovka, places where I was walking, I saw on video, places where I was physically standing just mere 2 weeks ago, being directly struck by drones, by Ukrainian missiles. So very, very unfortunate developments as the Ukrainians seem to be lashing out in loss, as it were. We're going to be discussing the huge escalations between Pakistan and Afghanistan, what really is going on there. I don't think most people fully understand, myself included. So we're going to be breaking down what's going on there. The Taliban versus current Pakistani regime, the ethnic conflict that it sort of represents. We're going to be discussing the economic stuff, the big developments with crypto, U.S. tariffs on China, other miscellaneous news, church news, as always. So it's going to be a packed week. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. And as you said, correctly put, it is an incredibly packed week, especially with this, I would say, groundbreaking development in the Middle East, right? For the first time, we have both Israeli spokespersons and members of various Arab states proclaiming that, this is the first step towards proper peace in the Middle East. And I think many people from these particular delegations of various nations, be it Qatar, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, Israel itself, and probably even Palestinian authorities, right? For example, representatives of Mahmoud Abbas are all saying this, and Erdogan, notwithstanding, are all saying this with tongue-in-cheek, knowing that, of course, this peace plan that Trump has proposed and Trump is essentially in charge of between Israel and Hamas, with the assistance of Steve Witkoff, first and foremost, is, of course, very temporary. This will not bring, of course, a lasting peace to the Middle East. This is, if anything, a ceasefire, right? One of the reasons for that is because, as we discussed last week, one of the key positions of the Trump administration in assuming this peace in the Gaza Strip between Hamas, specifically Hamas and the Palestinians resisting the IDF in Israel, and of course, the state of Israel itself, is the removal of Hamas from power. And not just from power, but its entire presence from the Gaza Strip itself. And this is key. So essentially, the vision for a peaceful Gaza Strip will have the Hamas organizations, so the Islamic resistance of the Palestinian people in Gaza will be completely disassembled and removed. Many of Hamas's leaders, and there's an entire list, will essentially already put together by Israel jointly with the US, will be told to leave Gaza and leave all of Palestine, in fact, and what the Israelis call Judea and Samaria, that is the West Bank, and any other Israeli territory forever for their entire lives, and they will never be able to return. So these are diplomats, the ones actually staying in Qatar, Doha at the moment. So the diplomatic branch leading Hamas, this is the military wing of Hamas, they will be granted sort of clemency, and they will be, of course, released. Now, it's very interesting how the number of people that Israel is actually trading for the 20 living hostages that Hamas still has in their possession, right? So Israel officially has agreed. And now Israel apparently holds 270 life imprisonment. So Israel doesn't have a death penalty, at least not on the books, legally speaking. But they do have a life imprisonment as the highest form of essentially severe punishment for criminals. And Israel has 270 Hamas-affiliated Palestinians, or those who they call essentially Palestinian terrorists, in their prisons, 270 of them. Israel will be releasing 250 of those 270, so a huge majority during this coming, literally either this Monday or this Tuesday, for the 20 hostages. In addition to that, and this is what, you'll probably hear many media sources state that Israel will be releasing 2,000 Palestinians. That's because an additional 1,700 Palestinians detained, but those who have probably not had a trial yet, haven't been charged necessarily according to all of the things that they've apparently transgressed against the state of Israel during this recent conflict from the 7th of October onwards. 1,700 Palestinians, women, children, males apparently associated with Hamas, will be also released by the state of Israel. So close to 2,000 people, give or take. Now, it's interesting that Israel has said that there's a particular red line. 20 of those so-called Palestinian terrorists whom they have been, essentially who they have charged and found guilty of terrorism are going to remain in Israeli custody. Israel said, we're not budging on those remaining 20. They're going to remain in custody for life imprisonment. But still, 250 out of 270 is a huge number. And Israel essentially is going to make that exchange at the beginning of this week. So frankly, as we're recording this episode, and most likely as you're listening to it, the exchange will be taking place on the ground, at least according to Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff's plan. And of course, we saw the carriers of that message, that plan, visit the Wailing Wall earlier last week. We saw, of course, Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, of course, the author of the Abraham Accords, his wife, Trump's daughter, Ivanka Trump, again, standing, praying at the wall to the Shekinah, Steve Witkoff there, and, of course, Mike Huckabee, and even the commander of CENTCOM as well. So the American admiral in charge of the American command in the Middle East. And of course, it's already been confirmed that 200 troops belonging to CENTCOM, so the American Central Command, that is essentially all the American bases governed by this admiral in the Middle East, they'll be delegating 200 American troops, or American specialists, I suppose, servicemen in the American army, to be essentially delegated to Israel to assist them in essentially conducting this Gaza ceasefire, Gaza peace deal operation. Now, there's been a lot of false reporting, Conrad, as you probably know, people saying, wow, there'll be 200 American troops stationed literally in the block post. Most likely not. If we're talking about like a small number of 200 American troops, most likely these are highly trained, some sort of Middle Eastern specialists, probably with knowledge of Arabic or Hebrew, who are going to be stationed in specific places around Israel, maybe even the West Bank, to try and secure this particular peace treaty. Now, I've listened to a very interesting interview by actually an advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, to his office, one of his personal aides, Dmitry Gendelman. He's a Russian-speaking Israeli. In the interview, he actually said very openly that in organizing this particular peace treaty, which now guarantees that Israel will control 58% of the Gaza Strip, at least, on paper, this is what's happening now, Israel has not communicated with Hamas directly at all. So Israel considers Hamas a complete figure of disrepute. Israel will never communicate directly with Hamas spokespersons. Israel only communicates with Hamas through people like Steve Witkoff, other delegates of the United States, or even other Arab delegates from countries like Qatar, Egypt, etc. So that's very interesting. So Israel still deems Hamas completely unacceptable, and they will be pushing for Hamas to be, of course, completely dissolved within the Gaza Strip. And then when Dmitry Gendelman was asked in the interview, well, what would happen if Hamas would not dissolve and not hand over their weapons according to the Trump's peace plan? And he said, well, this is why the Israeli army is standing by in those 58% of the Gaza Strip, which Israel will continue to occupy. And truth be told, Israel has stuck to this initial, preliminary peace agreement. They have moved out of those 42% Gaza Strip territories, which of course they've delegated to the Palestinians. And these are the territories which they, of course, have marked as Hamas controlled. So it's very interesting that Israel is standing by, essentially watching to see, will Hamas essentially put down their weapons? Will Hamas begin to leave the country once they're allowed? And also we have to keep in mind there'll also be a big exchange of the bodies of the deceased. There are 28, of course, deceased hostage bodies which Hamas and the Palestinians will be handing over to the Israelis, and there will be multitudes, probably hundreds of Palestinian bodies that the Israelis will be handing over to the Hamas authorities for, proper burials, etc. So it's a very big deal, this particular exchange. And, if it does take place, this will, of course, at least sort things out for us quite some time. The next stages, of course, will be very difficult. Of course, the disarming of Hamas, Conrad, most likely won't happen. Of course, this will lead to further clashes on the ground, maybe even a falling apart of this entire peace deal towards later parts of this week. So what we may see is an exchange of hostages. Following that, there will be a question raised. Okay, so what will happen with Hamas now? And then conflict will reissue perhaps Thursday, Friday, maybe even next weekend. And this is very highly likely an outcome of exactly how this week will play out. Now, if Hamas does begin literally dissolving itself, maybe under pressure from Qatar or Turkey, right? If they do agree to, say, Qatar or Turkey say, look, we're going to take in any Hamas refugees, those who wish to leave Gaza and leave the Holy Land in order to seek refuge abroad and to avoid persecution by the Israelis, then perhaps, of course, the peace plan will continue. And in a month or two, the next stage will kick in. And the next stage is even more interesting because that essentially involves essentially a joint coalitionary peacekeeping force from the Middle Eastern countries, comprising of Qataris, Jordanians, Egyptians, Turks, potentially even, of course, Lebanese servicemen, maybe even Syrians as well. It's not exactly clear which countries will be, of course, involved in this, but definitely those 4 countries I mentioned initially will be involved in sending at least 50,000 peacekeepers into the Gaza Strip and maybe even into the West Bank. Now, one more thing I need to mention real quick is that who is authority going to be handed over to in the Gaza Strip? Now, it won't be the Palestinian Authority or what the Israelis call the Palestinian Autonomy, because Fatah and, of course, the authority of Mahmoud Abbas is not recognized by Israel. So Israel does not recognize the PA in the West Bank, or what they call Judea and Samaria, west of the Jordan River. So they will not be giving any of the power to Mahmoud Abbas or any of the Palestinian groups currently in positions of authority who aren't pro-Hamas, because they consider those groups also anti-Israeli, which, in our eyes, we've mentioned many times that Hamas is radically anti-Israeli. However, these other groups are perhaps maybe a bit more lenient. And of course, many anti-Zionists online, you'll see them, of course, call some of these maybe less severe anti-Zionist groups maybe a bit compromising, maybe even compromised by Israel. However, the official Israeli position is that both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip need to have transparent, accountable, democratic, liberal elections to elect their own new Palestinian governance in both respective regions. So Israel actually wants a complete reshuffling of power in both Palestinian zones in the Holy Land, which is very, very interesting. So notice they're not happy with Mahmoud Abbas, they're not happy with the PA, not happy with Fatah, and Israel actually wants a complete reshuffling of power. And look, if there is an exchange of hostages, an exchange of Palestinian prisoners from Israel's care, this will be a good sort of first step. However, how is their safety guaranteed once they enter into that 42% controlled Gazan zone and humanitarian aid is given to the Palestinians? Because conflict will no doubt ensue, because Hamas has not actually signed on to the fact that they will be handing over all of their weapons. Hamas has said that at the moment they're not considering dissolving themselves because they consider themselves correctly elected and democratically elected authority in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is not just the military organization, right? It's not just the militia, according to say American 1776 Second Amendment standards. It's not just an American revolutionary force. It's an actual elected government which chose to sort of radicalize itself given, over the last 2 decades, given what has taken place, of course, with the oppression of the Palestinians, with of course, a very distinct Islamic Muslim Brotherhood flavor inside of the Gaza Strip. So we have to keep that in mind. So it's a very complex situation, but definitely stay tuned, follow our Telegram to sort of see how the situation plays out. And, God willing, the living hostages, the living prisoners will be exchanged. And then perhaps once Trump, of course, visits Cairo, once he visits the Knesset, the Israeli parliament in Israel itself, and maybe then there will be some sort of stand down. Maybe Trump can apply some pressure to Netanyahu to, you know, tell him to lay off of Hamas for a little bit, because Hamas dissolving, Conrad, I don't see that as something that is tenable at all, because it's simply impractical from what we've seen and from the statements being made by essentially the anti-Israeli side.
No, it's clear that Israel is trying their best to prevent, again, obviously not Hamas from having any kind of power, but really any kind of relevant Palestinian authority that has any kind of popular support. They don't want that empowered in the Gaza Strip at all. They don't even want that powered in the West Bank, which unfortunately it, barely is, because we do know that Fatah, collaborates closely with the Israelis while also being completely oppressed by them. So a true kind of Shabbos Goyim situation. But of course, many people have heard that the most popular Palestinian leader, who at one point was a leader of Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, Marwan Barghouti, he's one of the people that has been demanded to be released by Hamas. He's like the main prisoner they want to release, and the Israelis are completely rejecting that because they know he would probably win a Palestine-wide election. And I guess he's too hard on Israel. He's too much of a potentially one-state solution supporter, not recognizing Israel and wanting Palestine to fight for all of the area, not just the 1967 allotted borders. Of course, Saudi Arabia has made it clear that they will not be recognizing Israel under the Netanyahu government or until a two-state solution is, moved toward and is, the process begins to actually establish that. So, the Saudis are doing their best to maintain frame, because it's likely they're going to be accused by other Muslim countries, like you said, Dimitri. Qatar and Turkey, Muslim Brotherhood countries, are being boxed out. They want Saudi, Jordan, these other countries, the Emirates, to come in and be the ones that are really dominating the Gaza Strip with Israeli supervision. But it's clear that if they're not going to let Barghouti out, if they're not going to support the current Fatah administration with Mahmoud Abbas, because one of the demands that the Israelis keep insisting on is that the Palestinian Authority must be completely reformed and de-radicalized, which is an extremely, broad, generic term, before they can actually rule anywhere. I mean, before they will even, this is not even talking about ruling Gaza. This is before Israel will even formally recognize and engage with them, even in the context as the obvious rulers of the West Bank, which they do, control the parts of that Israel doesn't completely occupy. And of course, we've seen new settler expansions. They continue to move into the West Bank, into the Golan Heights, into these other Israeli occupied areas, even though, Trump has told them they really need to stop with the settlements. Technically, the United States doesn't recognize most of these settlements. The Golan Heights, unfortunately, Trump, did recognize those, but we're hearing more and more about other countries wanting to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the Abraham Accords, as, Jared Kushner, the mastermind of, he went to Israel. Trump wants to, Trump talks about adding Iran to the Abraham Accords, which, Israel hears that and means, oh, of course, regime change in Iran, which is obviously what Netanyahu is pressing for next. I mean, just in the past few hours, Netanyahu said the war is not yet over. Some of our enemies are rapidly rebuilding and preparing to attack us. Of course, talking about Iran. Recent Iranian close advisors of the Ayatollah have said that they wish Iran had nuclearized. These are obviously veiled threats that, in theory, the Ayatollah is being influenced towards allowing and, removing the fatwa or the restrictions on nuclear weapons that the Iranian clerical state currently has. Abbas Araghchi, of course, confirmed recently, obviously, Iran declined the American-Egyptian invitation to attend the Gaza ceasefire summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, where all these Arab states, all the Muslim countries are going to be meeting. Putin, I believe, also canceled his meeting that he was trying to have with all these Arab states because not enough of them were going to be there, because they're all going to the United States, which proves that, the U.S. and Israel are still the big dogs in the Middle East, despite Russia and China, making their friends and being in the region. Unfortunately, Israel and the U.S., they're the ones that, really call the shots there. And of course, in the Gaza Strip, we're seeing the reports of these Hamas people attacking these other clans that have taken up arms against Hamas. And you see the different reporting, from the more Zionist OSINT crowd. You see them talking about Hamas slaughtering members of the clan, of this clan or that family, making them sound just like totally independent people. And then on the pro-Palestine OSINT side, you have them saying, Israeli-supported, ISIS-backed clans, which, both of these things are true in some capacity. Both sides are obviously, I think, exaggerating, but it's clear that Hamas is, doing their best to clean house from these people that did side with Israel, now that the Israeli authorities aren't able to protect their Palestinian allies that are on the ground there. Of course, Palestinian Islamic Jihad is still probably even, more extreme in their rejection of these deals than Hamas, but they've clearly been, ordered by Hamas to not continue fighting. The ceasefire seems to be holding for now, even though Israel's still controlling over 50% of the Gaza Strip. They are conducting operations against hostile actors within the areas they still control. So in many ways, the war is not exactly over, but there is no more indiscriminate shelling. Hamas is not fighting back and attacking Israeli tanks. So that's what we're seeing right now. As much as it's, the future of Palestine is still uncertain, I'd be lying if I didn't say that it was a relief. And I think that, the hundreds of thousands of people flocking back to North Gaza probably feel the same way. We've seen some pretty crazy videos over the bridges and crossing the Netzrahim corridor that the Israelis occupied for so long, and were shooting civilians that attempted to return to their homes or search for their loved ones in the rubble. So it is a relief to see a lot of these images. But as far as the U.S. troops there, Dimitri, you're right. J.D. Vance was forced to make a video, insisting, no U.S. troops are going to be in Israel. Of course, there are already the 100 U.S. troops that operate the 2 THAAD missile interceptors that are in Israel to protect them from Iranian missiles, which, again, that's one of the things that Trump clearly could have done to threaten Israel and to pressure Israel to do the right thing, but that was clearly never allowed. The idea of allowing Jewish civilians to fall victim to missile strikes is, that's not about aid or pressure. That's just common sense. Whereas, in realpolitik and in real politics and geopolitics, everything is on the table, obviously. And Trump should have said, all right, we're taking our THAAD missiles back if you don't do this. But of course, that's not how these things work. The Jews have it locked up on either side. But despite all the good news coming out of Gaza, the progress being made, potentially towards a 2-state solution, obviously Netanyahu's escalating against Iran, and they continue to escalate against Lebanon. Here from Jason Bitz, there was a major Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon. They kill 1 civilian, wound 7 others. Israel attacks southern Lebanon on an almost daily basis, but this morning the strike was one of the heaviest in weeks, targeting a heavy machinery store in the village of Masala. The strikes did enormous damage to infrastructure to be used in post-war reconstruction, and also temporarily severed the highway leading from Beirut to the south of the country. So it's clear that Israel is still heavily isolating the south, trying to basically turn it into a second Gaza, and likely, annex the land south of the Litani River, annex even more of that. We know that even more moderate Greater Israel proponents consider a lot of Lebanon to be part of Greater Israel. So Israel continues their 7-front war. The Houthis have said they will be monitoring Israel's violations of the ceasefire, and that if there are violations, they'll continue the fight. I'm sure the Israelis are preparing even more strikes against Ansar Allah to try to get al-Houthi himself and actually begin to dismantle that regime. And I don't really personally know the current status of Houthi-Saudi relations, but I'm sure the Saudis will eventually join up with Israel to fully wipe out Ansar Allah, if that's even possible, which, I'm not convinced it necessarily is. But unless you have any other thoughts on Palestine, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Iran, the future there. We know that the IAEA and Iran now have no interactions at all. If the IAEA has requests or questions or inquiries, they're told to write to the Supreme National Security Council of Iran. So they are no longer an entity recognized in Iran. And that's obviously a sign to the United States that we aren't in the mood to negotiate, and you need to restrain your rabid Israeli dog. Sure, they might have stopped bombing Gaza for now, but we know that they're preparing to do the next step, which, again, the only real step that Israel can take after the 12-day war is to kill Ayatollah Khamenei himself. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that developing situation.
And just before I move on to Iran, I do want to mention that Israel, as of October this year, and most likely when you're listening to this episode, it'll be more or less exactly 1 year from the next Israeli legislative elections. Now, keep in mind, because of the weird structure, as we mentioned with Truth Teller on our recent 8th Hour episode, the weird structure of the Israeli government, essentially the presidential post, of course, is almost purely decorative, but you do have the post of prime minister is super important. So, of course, the elections in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament/Congress, are very sort of monumental, and those, of course, will take place in October of 2026, so exactly 12 months from now, from the recording of this episode. And it'll be very interesting to see exactly how Likud, as well as its allies, the Zionist, religious Zionist Party, United Torah Judaism, the Shas, and of course, all the other allies that it has that make up a majority, because remember, the Knesset has 120 seats, and Netanyahu's Likud party only has 32 of those seats as of right now. So 32 out of 61 really is just a bit over 50%. And yet it does rely on some of those really radical Talmudic allies within Israeli politics, which is why Netanyahu, as many people say, well, Likud, Netanyahu, these people are secular Israelis, secular Jews. However, notice is Netanyahu's closest allies are these radical, essentially Talmudic expansionist settler factions, notwithstanding one of them, of course, being Itamar Ben-Gvir, whose party holds 6 seats. And he personally has said that he will be advocating for essentially a new cleansing of the Gaza Strip if Hamas is not dissolved. So he's already put forward those threats like openly, publicly. People are saying Ben-Gvir right now, he is just posturing. He's being this hawk in order for this 12-month pre-election image of him going forward to sort of be reinforced, because already 12 months before the next election, this is already the pre-election period, so to speak, in Israeli politics. And it'll be interesting to see exactly how will these radical Israeli politicians, including Benjamin Netanyahu, if he wishes to go up for re-election, considering his very interesting court hearings coming up and all kinds of investigations into his conduct since October 7th, 2023, and even preceding that, how was he involved? Was he accountable for what happened on the 7th of October? All of these investigations inside and outside of Israel, how exactly will that impact his particular leadership of Israel? So all of this is up in the air. And of course, Conrad, when a rat is backed into a corner, it begins to bite and claw back. And this is exactly what I think Netanyahu will be doing, hence the ever-expanding Israeli sort of presence. And the existing presence is it's not retreating from either the south of Lebanon or the southwest of Syria. So Israel, of course, is standing firm on its positions in terms of foreign policy. Of course, Netanyahu is one of his sort of biggest Zionist victories, we can almost say, in the last 2 years. But of course, Iran does feel the pressure from abroad, especially given Jared Kushner and many American politicians, their statements about Jordan and Egypt, for example, joining the Abraham Accords recently, which is very noteworthy because, again, they've mentioned al-Jilani, al-Shara potentially joining the Abraham Accords, Azerbaijan, President Aliyev, who we'll be talking about a bit later in the episode in relation to Putin. There's been some developments there as well. All these countries apparently may be joining the Abraham Accords. And notice the Abraham Accords, this particular set of agreements, this networking coalition, Conrad, is very much turning into this anti-axis of resistance in some capacity. So essentially an anti-Iranian axis in the Middle East. We can always say this very clearly. It's not necessarily a accords which lead to Middle Eastern peace. If anything, it's an anti-Shia coalition of nations. And of course, primarily led by the Gulf Arab states with their incredible wealth. But in Iran's case, what's very interesting is that Iran, of course, has increased its oil export. Its oil exports are peaking at the moment. So Iran has been making as much money as possible in this sort of stage in the last 4 months, between the 12-day war in June and now October. So in the last 4 months, Iran's been trying to get up to speed, to catch up, to reformat its economy. We understand that there's been heavy shipments of military equipment of some sort. Again, these are mysterious shipments. There have been Antonov planes flying from the Russian oblast of Irkutsk in Siberia to Iran, landing at airports and dropping off some sort of heavy machinery. So these Antonov planes, of course, they can carry tons of equipment, tanks, maybe missile launchers. And we've been seeing that every few weeks or so, especially this week. A big Antonov has landed in Iran delivering something. So whether or not these are gratuitous donations by Russia, Conrad, or if these are actual military sales that Russia is conducting with Iran. So again, potentially even big trades of some sort. Russia is considering that, look, given the constriction Iran is experiencing in the Middle East, and Russia being essentially noticed, Russia is not a party to any of these Abraham Accords, nor this peace discussion between the Palestinians and Israel. It's been completely pushed out of the talks. And there's also been Russian planes, of course, landing in the Khmeimim Latakia base as well in western Syria, which we'll mention Syria in a bit. But yeah, Iran absolutely has been incredibly active and has also been posturing aggressively. So not just the Iranian foreign minister, Conrad, but also the president, Dr. Pezeshkian, has been essentially giving the same talking points. Even before the 12-day war, we can almost say that, well, there are factions within Iranian politics and they're somewhat disunited on foreign policy, whether or not they're more peaceful, more dovish, or more aggressive, hawkish. But now it seems like all of Iran is united, at least what appears to us, those sort of outside of Iran, they're all united around the supreme leader and the idea that Iran needs to remain sovereign, united, and sort of externally powerful towards its enemies. It needs to sort of face outwards, like as we said before, it's like a steel porcupine or a hedgehog, and essentially needs to be armed against its enemies. It needs to build these relations with Central Asian nations, and of course China and Russia in particular. So Iran at the moment is preparing for something, and they're not incorrect to do so, because the American presence, of course, in the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea, in the Eastern Mediterranean, it's still very heavy. Israel still has the greatest air force in the entire Middle East, 800 plus warplanes, etc. So, and of course, with the loosening of the conflict in the Gaza Strip, and with Netanyahu's re-election coming up, Conrad, there's only, we just have to speculate as to what exactly he will do next in terms of, pushing his personal pro-Israeli Zionist patriotic agenda forward. And of course, we've been talking about the potential war in Iran, by probably a joint coalition of at least America, maybe Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Israel, for a while now, because it's a real possibility. As we said, the first year of the Trump administration before January, this will be the best time for a strike against the Iranian regime, for a beheading, not necessarily a ground operation into Iran, because again, Iran is much more difficult to go into on foot than even Iraq, be it 1990 or 2003. An invasion of Iran on the ground will be probably one of the most tumultuous operations. It's equivalent to perhaps something as difficult as a joint Taiwanese-American operation to invade China on the ground. Let's just say, I won't compare it to a ground invasion of Russia, which is, I think, a little bit more difficult than that, but it is one of the hardest countries to invade on the ground. But long-range bombardment, of course, Operation Midnight, Hammer-esque strikes, Israeli F-35s flying in, dropping bombs. Of course, Israeli growing ties of Armenia, Azerbaijan, collaboration, of course, with Turkey. Again, Turkey is not pro-Iranian by any stretch. All of these threats Iran can see. Iran is planning out its future. And I think at the moment we are in this pre-war preparation. Unfortunately, we just have to say it as it is. There is no clear foresight for a peaceful 2026. And that's, to put it very lightly, because we are at the end of 2025 here. So, and this year has already been full of war, if anything, even more so than 2024. So looking up into the next year here, Iran will be, I think, within the crosshairs of both the Trump administration, unfortunately, we just have to say it as it is, and naturally the hyper-aggressive Israeli Zionist agenda, because Iran is the last country on that list that needs to be removed from the Middle East in order to secure potentially like a greater Israeli project for Israel to expand and to bully its weaker and more, as you said, Conrad, subversive Shabbos Goy nations and allies in the Middle East. Everyone else will bow the knee or at least collaborate. Iran, of course, has stood firm as an anti-Israeli country since its inception, essentially since the 1979 revolution, which was brought around by Khamenei's predecessor. And, we have to say there is a Mullah Twelver sort of flavor to the anti-Zionism. It isn't an anti-Judaism. It isn't anti-Talmudic, but it certainly is anti-Western and very heavily anti-Zionist. And they've been pushing this particular anti-Americanism, anti-Israelianism, essentially for the last 50 years or so. And, this is a problem which America and Israel are trying to resolve. And I think the only way to do that, Conrad, unfortunately, is through armed conflict. So we just have to always have a look out for on Iran, exactly how it's building up its forces. And sadly, I have to mention one thing, that if Russia doesn't provide enough S-400 systems, for example, enough air defense systems, and even, I have to say, even if Russia provides 100 more Sukhoi fighter planes to Iran, it still won't bridge that disparity between the American and the Israeli Air Force. And, God forbid, the Air Force of the Gulf states, they will always hold superiority over that of Iran. So the only thing really Iran can do is deal with its internal spy networks, cleanse them, from its territory as efficiently as possible, preceding this next coming conflict, build up its drone capacity, and also, of course, train up its pilots who will be facing at least a 10-to-1 disadvantage if there is a massive World War III tier conflict coming up here in the Middle Eastern region.
Yeah, the situation obviously politically in Israel is sort of a meme, because obviously Netanyahu is unpopular among, large swaths of the population. But at the same time, even the people that hate Netanyahu are still neurotic Zionists that, if you just pepper everything you say with the fear of Iran, the fear of Hamas, the fear of anti-Semitism, the fear of the new Muslim-backed Shoah, then, oh, well, guess we got to suspend democracy again. Guess we got to let Netanyahu stay in power. And that's obviously what is happening right now. But the thing happened with the negotiations and the latest developments in Cairo. Of course, we had 4 of the Qatari delegation members killed in some kind of car crash, which, again, maybe, Arabs are, a lot of them drive really fast. Maybe, they like to drive really fast in the desert. It wouldn't surprise me if it was just a car accident, but it seems very suspicious that, 4 of the members of the delegation that Israel considers, I don't know if it's Turkey or Qatar that Israel considers more of an enemy at this point, but they're pretty much the top 2 guys besides Iran that, a large swath of the members of that delegation are now no longer with us. It does seem a little bit suspicious, much like many other deaths that are connected to Israel, but we're going to keep monitoring the progress of the ceasefire situation. At any moment, some Hamas cell or some false flag or some Israeli group could completely decide to violate the ceasefire, and we could be right back to the past 2 years like we were. So, Trump claims the ceasefire is going to last 3,000 years. Obviously, that's not true. But they said at least, maybe 10 years or something like that. Maybe Gaza will no longer be the focal point of the ongoing Third World War. We might see a pivot specifically to Iran, which I do think October, November is really going to tell the tale on the next phase of the Israel-Iranian war. And I think perhaps all sorts of different angles with Turkey, whether it be in Syria or whether it be with Russia. I do believe we're going to see exactly how that's going to shake out in the next few years as well, if not the next few months. So that's a big piece of this. But I guess unless you have anything else to say about the Middle East, Dimitri, we do need to talk about the escalations in Venezuela. This is from Kyle Anzalone. As the U.S. is engaging in a large military buildup in the Caribbean, there is a growing number of statements from U.S. officials suggesting that a bombing campaign inside Venezuela could soon begin. Starting in September, the U.S. began conducting strikes against alleged boats operated by Latin American drug cartels in international waters. Defense officials told The Atlantic that these operations could soon expand to inside Venezuelan territory. The campaign could extend inside Venezuelan territorial waters or include drone strikes inside its land borders, the officials explained. The State Department has designated about a dozen Latin American cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. President Trump says the U.S. is in an armed conflict with the narco-terrorist cartels and has authorized the Department of War to conduct lethal strikes. So far, at least 21 people have been extrajudicially executed during Trump's bombing campaign. There is growing concern that the strikes among cartels will expand beyond the gangs to the Venezuelan government. President Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have claimed that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is the leader of a designated terrorist narco cartel. The Atlantic notes that there are problems with the Trump administration's allegations against Maduro. The White House lacks evidence for the claim that Maduro is the leader of a cartel, and only a small amount of drugs in the U.S. are trafficked through Venezuela. Last week, Trump ended the negotiations with Venezuela. On Wednesday, Politico reported that a person familiar with the Trump administration said there is now a coherent, whole-of-government strategy to eliminate Cartel de las Soles and its leader, which is an interesting way of framing that there is now a complete agreement among the State Department and the Pentagon in Washington to do regime change in Venezuela. That's obviously the goal at this point, and the New York Times report that came out this week, citing anonymous sources, claimed basically that Maduro and his negotiators in Washington basically came forward to a Rick Grenell-led delegation and said, we're willing to concede everything. We're willing to give you all of our resources at the best, negotiated deals. We're going to abandon multipolarity and no longer work with China, Iran, and Russia. Literally just everything that the U.S. wanted and more, as long as, Maduro gets to stay in power. And reportedly, Marco Rubio said no. So obviously there's some aspects of the report that could easily not be true. I would be a little bit surprised if the negotiators were just openly willing to say that, yes, we're abandoning China, Russia, and Iran, knowing that potentially the deal could get rejected, and then you would still need to rely on those allies. So, I'm a little bit skeptical of that, but I'm not skeptical of the idea that Maduro is effectively willing to concede anything to stay in power. I think that's obvious. Like, people need to realize Maduro is not, he's not Hamas, he's not the Houthis, he's not, eager to be a martyr for an eternal, at least what he perceives to be an eternal cause. He is ultimately a petty communist dictator of a very, very shitty country. So, he's just trying to do everything he can to stay in power, to not get locked up in American jail, to not get locked up in The Hague, or to not get, have his building stormed by U.S.-backed or Colombian-backed or whoever, terrorists, and get shot in his presidential palace. So, I don't know exactly what Maduro's planning is. They are, filling the streets with anti-tank, anti-vehicle, concrete devices, shipping containers. They're air defending, planting air defenses and walling off their airports for extended periods of time. They're weaponizing their shore and their coastline, which is, everyone on the coast in Venezuela can see all of these U.S. Ships, basically blockading and besieging the northern South American nations. So, very interesting developments. We've heard about the U.S. weaponizing Grenada, Puerto Rico, many of these other islands that are U.S. allies. Of course, the U.S. invaded Grenada back in the later half of the 20th century. And we're clearly seeing the full Monroe Doctrine, the full, U.S. adventurous nature abroad happening within our Caribbean backyard. So it's quite fascinating to see. And unfortunately, it is just a continuation of the first Trump administration's campaign against Venezuela, because, Trump is the one that initially sanctioned and did full pressure basically against the Maduro regime, which facilitated the mass invasion of our country by millions and millions of Venezuelans. I think over 50%, if not over 65% of the illegal immigrants of the 10 million that came in under Joe Biden were Venezuelan, largely facilitated by the heavy pressure campaign that Trump has put on Venezuela that led to their currency collapsing, major food insecurity, and general unrest. So that was, as much as Biden bears responsibility for opening the borders, Trump bears responsibility for entirely destabilizing a country that is technically connected by land to the United States. So what was going to happen there? But of course, the actual, behind the scenes situation with multipolarity with the Russians and the Chinese and how they're advising Maduro, nobody really knows. Of course, Russia, much like they've been providing a lot more support and air defense and jets and planes for the Iranians, it's clear that they're also, helping Maduro and the Venezuelan regime. Both the Chinese and Russian representatives at the United Nations talked about how the encroachment on Venezuela is unacceptable. So I don't know. I don't think World War III is going to happen because of Venezuela, but it's clear that, Venezuela's strategic value, their resources, and their, proximity to the United States is much like Cuba's proximity to the United States is viewed as important enough to Russia, China, and these former communist countries that they want to prop up the largely failing governments of these countries. I mean, the Cuban regime can't even keep, they can't even keep their lights on. So the Venezuelan regime isn't far behind. So, obviously I'm not expecting imminent, American troops on the ground in Venezuela, but, limited strikes across Venezuela and more pressure on the Maduro campaign, it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think what's very interesting is that, of course, the United Nations Security Council, in particular, Russia and China, first and foremost have the permanent members of the Security Council. They've already spoken out. Of course, Fu Kong, the Chinese ambassador to the UN, as well as Basil Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador to the UN, they've already spoken out and completely condemned the US's agitation of the Venezuelan issue. In particular, Nebenzia said, "An excellent subject for a Hollywood blockbuster in which the Americans would once again save the world, but these assertions are not underpinned by facts at all." That is, Trump's war against the Cartel de los Solos. He's basically calling it a movie. He's calling Trump essentially an agitator, and there's no real presence of any sort of real cartel threat to America's, say, foreign or domestic policy that will warrant essentially a strike of 4,000 to 10,000 American troops and the American Navy essentially and the Coast Guard against the Venezuelans. Because at this point, speculation rises that the American presence in the South Caribbean around Venezuela is now increased to over 10,000 personnel. That is, members of the American Air Force, members of the American Coast Guard, Navy, and there is at least one American naval submarine, most likely armed to the teeth with Tomahawk missiles, the same Tomahawks we spoke about last week. And of course, the American Navy warships also armed with Tomahawks. We have to keep in mind, most likely, not sure how well equipped the Venezuelans are, as you said, Conrad, with air defense missile systems capable of shooting down Tomahawk missiles. But during the Clinton administration, for example, the Soviet era, very, very old Cold War era anti-air defense missile systems set up in Afghanistan, for example, could not stop the Clinton bombardment of Afghanistan back in the 1990s. So I'm not too sure what the socialist era military technology of Maduro and his predecessors is capable of doing, especially if these Tomahawks are shot at key targets around the country in order to destabilize the military particular system. And notice, it's probably going to be a combination of essentially airstrikes and strikes from Tomahawks from the American warships and the submarine, well, that will most likely lead to a destabilization within the nation itself. Once they start shooting at Venezuelan naval and military bases, what you'll see is there's going to be generals and admirals within the Venezuelan military and even members of the Venezuelan Air Force who will begin having second thoughts about, well, should we actually support President Maduro, considering the loss of our positions if say the opposition comes to power or there's a regime change, or should we try and maybe shoot for the stars and go for that $50 million bounty, which is, 10,000 times higher than the salary we will receive throughout our entire lifetimes serving the Venezuelan state. So, of course, they're going to put their patriotism into question. And it's very interesting, Conrad. Of course, we understand the international community in terms of like the globalists, right? Outside of the UN, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee has already given the Nobel Peace Prize to, of course, Maria Corina Machado, who, of course, wasn't allowed to run in last year's Venezuelan election. She was the main sort of Tikhanovskaya/Navalny type figure in Venezuela. She's the female democratic liberal oppositionary figure to President Maduro. Now, notwithstanding, I'm not exactly sure how many votes she would have received last year if she was actually allowed to run in the Venezuelan election, but her current position as a sort of this liberal, pro-American, pro-alphabet community oppositionary leader has been highlighted by essentially this granting of the Peace Prize. And that's despite the fact that everyone's been kind of pushing for Trump to be given the Peace Prize. And the Nobel Committee responded, especially in relation to the recent changes in essentially the Middle Eastern peace discussions. They've stated, look, we've already decided to, on granting Maria Corina Machado the Nobel Peace Prize before the Trump-Gaza peace deal. So they're kind of making excuses. They're like, look, Trump's trying to achieve peace, but we already decided on this woman long before. And what that tells me, Conrad, is the Nobel Peace Prize Committee and the Nobel Committee in and of itself, which is, mind you, the Nobel Committee is comprised these days and of mostly members of the tribe. There's a lot of that presence there is very much felt, and this is why many members of the tribe have received the Nobel Prize over the last 100 years or so. So we just have to keep in mind that entire prize structure is essentially a globalist promotion machine, an international organization essentially that doesn't really stand for conservative values first and foremost. So it is very interesting. They have an oppositionary figure, Conrad. They have the American Navy standing by, the American Air Force, the Coast Guard. Everything is somewhat ready. And the entire Guyana Essequibo saga, which we spoke about last year, will also be resolved, right, in Guyana's favor. Guyana, of course, being still very much contingent and one of the Commonwealth sort of subordinate dominion nations of the United Kingdom, right? An ally, obviously a great NATO ally and also an Atlantic bilateral ally of the US. So this benefits America and its allies greatly if the Maduro regime was to fall. And, notwithstanding the illegal immigration issue, but if anything, regional destabilization and a war inside of Venezuela, maybe even an ensuing civil war on the ground after long-range bombardment has been already conducted, because we understand 10,000, even 5,000, 10,000 American troops, Marines, etc., they won't really go up against the 100,000 strong militia. I don't doubt the valor and the capacity of American servicemen, which is probably like yards and leagues ahead of any sort of Venezuelan elite guards. However, just the numbers here are completely skewed, and also the logistics, going into SEAL Team 6 style into the presidential palace of Maduro, via helicopters at nighttime. I think that's a little bit too risky, especially, God forbid, American commandos are captured by Venezuelan socialists, Conrad, and they're, filmed on tape, giving confessions. And, this will it's a big PR loss for Trump. I think Trump, if he allows that to happen, a much safer option is, of course, long-range bombardment, internal destabilization, and, of course, calling it not a war against terror, but a war against drugs, a war against narcos. And this is like a very easy way to frame the entire situation and then claim that, look, the entire regime shouldn't even exist because Maria Machado should be the president, and wrap it up. And of course, I somewhat believe that Maduro is in fact trying to pivot out of this by claiming that, look, I'm going to distance myself from China, Russia, Iran. However, the recent leaks from Washington, anonymous insider, the bureaucrat, or whoever leaked the recent discussions between Maduro's aides in Washington, D.C., where he apparently said that he's going to completely break with China and Russia if only his regime is allowed to exist. I think this is very much obviously anti-Maduro information piece drop by this Western media source, I think it was Washington Post, or whichever other media outlook dropped this particular story, it's now being spreading all over the media that Maduro is willing to essentially betray his Eastern Second World, more socialist allies in order to, of course, retain power. And I think it's partially just to discredit Maduro inside of the country as well as to his particular allies. But correctly put, Conrad, Russian and Chinese opposition, verbally, diplomatically speaking, Russia has opposed many of America's operations around the world, except, of course, for the 2011 operation in Libya. Unfortunately, the Medvedev administration kind of greenlit that entire operation against Gaddafi. So Russia and China have stood firm on these sort of, I don't want to call it imperialist, but essentially Zog globalist operations around the world. And yet, diplomatically speaking out against it is only going to take you so far. If Trump, his administration, is willing to take out Maduro and his, essentially his administration within the country, the real onus, the real weight is going to fall on the shoulders of the Venezuelans themselves. Are they willing to, just like the Palestinians? Notice the Palestinians never gave up their Hamas leaders to the Israelis. They never betrayed, even if they didn't agree with Hamas, they never betrayed their own. We didn't hear any stories about Palestinians, for example, backstabbing one another during this recent conflict since the 7th of October. If the Venezuelans hold fast and they're as consolidated and as patriotic as the Venezuelans are, then perhaps no matter how many Tomahawks or F-35s fly over the Venezuelan nation, the country won't necessarily fall. But I have my doubts, and one of those doubts, of course, Conrad, this comes from our A4 discussion on episode 89 with Jose Nino. I think the very nature, the multiracialness, the multicultural nature of Venezuela and some of those other South American nations in and of itself, the quasi-Marxist, and even the fact that Maduro himself, he is a bit of a chameleon. Like, he used to claim that he had Sephardic ancestry just to sort of win some points with the local South American Jews. Like, this is all very bizarre behavior. It shows inconsistency. Whereas noticing the Palestinian resistance, we saw sort of real foundational solidification around the idea of an anti-Zionist resistance. Here, I don't really see it. And, I have my doubts as to exactly how much bombardment, how much pressure externally the Venezuelan regime and the people can sustain before they essentially begin folding. So that's the sort of unfortunate prediction for Venezuela there. But hopefully, this is all essentially a big theater play, as Nebenzia said in the UN. Hopefully this is all a big blockbuster show and Trump is just posturing, and his real plan is essentially just to pressure the Maduro regime to cave to certain concessions and to become an anti-Brixian partner of America. However, I think the dedication of the Nobel Peace Prize and all the other, of course, stories we see against Cartel de los Solos, the Cartel of the Suns, it's pointing towards one particular direction, and that's a regime change type conflict between the US and Venezuela.
No, of course, like you said, Machado, she dedicated the Nobel Peace Prize to Trump. Putin, for some reason, felt the need to weigh in and say that Trump deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. But obviously, the Nobel Peace Prize is obviously largely controlled and decided by people controlled by Jews or Jews themselves. So they wouldn't be interested in rewarding the Gaza ceasefire because many Israelis that voted for parties in Netanyahu's governing coalition are disappointed in the ceasefire. They wanted to see Amalek fully destroyed in all directions, take the Sinai Peninsula, take the West Bank, take Jordan, take Lebanon, take half of Syria. That's what they wanted to see. So ending the negotiations, Trump, big broing Netanyahu, making him apologize, really pushing into the media all these stories about how, Netanyahu and, is having to cave to Trump and all this stuff. I'm sure Jews don't like seeing any of that, being forced to play second fiddle to Goy leaders. That is not exactly how they want to play the game. So obviously it wouldn't surprise me if Maduro does ultimately fall, but then we have to ask what happens if Maduro falls. And if you thought that the Venezuelan refugee crisis during the Biden years was bad, we're going to have like 2 million Venezuelans lined up on the wall chanting, calling us fascist, begging to be let in. The media campaign would be absolutely crazy about these caravans. And, who knows what happens if a bunch of them start getting in. We already have a huge problem with Venezuelan gangs and, major ethnic enclaves forming where there's a lot of crime. So in my opinion, we can't afford another one of those, and we shouldn't be agitating the Maduro regime at all. And if they're willing to give us all their stuff, why not take the deal? And it's clear that this is about a lot more than just resources. This is about dismantling the base that Russia and China and these other powers have on the northern part of the South American continent, and any ability to threaten the United States, as well as mostly, I think, sending a message to leaders that want to stand up to the unipolar power, to stand up to the Atlanticist establishment and say that it doesn't matter if you give up everything, if you're one of these people, it's too late for you. So unfortunately, it appears that cooler heads are not prevailing, although who knows, after all of this New York Times report and all this backlash, maybe people will be pressured to take some kind of deal with Maduro. But I fear that we may be entering the end game and that we have gone too far to go back when it comes to the escalation there. We saw the second in command of Venezuela driving around in a truck talking about how it's basically already wartime. So it might be hard to put this genie back in the bottle. But speaking of genies that are clearly proving impossible to put back in the bottle, the Russia-Ukraine war continues to advance. Russia continues to advance into Dnipropetrovsk. They continue to advance towards into Pokrov's and past Rounded, forming new salients. Multiple new cauldrons have been formed, and Ukrainian counteroffensive have been repelled. Unfortunately, in their losses, the Ukrainians have resorted to shelling the city centers of the Donetsk People's Republic and towns there. We saw the city center of Donetsk brutally shelled. A bus was taken. I believe 3 people were killed as a civilian bus was attacked by a drone in Donetsk city center. We saw Gorlovka coming under heavy drone and I think even missile fire with several casualties. It was actually right in front of this memorial children's museum that I actually went to when I was in Gorlovka, that memorializes the dozens of children that have been killed by Ukrainian bombs and drones since 2014, since the conflict really began there. And they were hitting civilians just walking on the street right in front of this museum. No military installations there, no military significance. I was there myself, can confirm there was no military installations, but it's clear that I don't know if it's for troop morale for the Ukrainians to shell civilians. I don't know if they just want to punish the people in areas that they know voted overwhelmingly to join Russia. I think it's probably a combination of both. But unfortunately, while it is good that the Ukrainians are losing across the front, they are in there, like you said, Dimitri, like a mouse or a snake backed into a corner. They are lashing out in very, very despicable ways.
No, absolutely. And look, as far as the Russians, when they did take Bakhmut all the way back in May of 2023, one of the big reasons of taking both Bakhmut and Solidar, mainly with the help of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin and Wagner, the main reasons for that was to push the front line away from cities like Donetsk and Gorlovka in the Donetsk People's Republic Oblast, and essentially not allow the Ukrainians to so easily long-range bomb Donetsk and Gorlovka, these two very heavily populated cities which Conrad just recently visited. I mean, this was key to sort of keep the civilians safe. But unfortunately, the Ukrainians are still, despite the fact that these missiles, right, they probably flew over tens of thousands of Russian troops, including their formations on the actual front line. So these are intentional long-range bombardments, which frankly, in a conflict should have been aimed at their own adversaries in the military, not civilian targets somewhere far away in the rear. Again, this only proves, as you said, Conrad, that this is essentially a strike of terroristic nature, right? Trying to demoralize the Russians, and again, most likely appease whichever satanic mnemonic deity gods that these people are praying to at the Rose Synagogue in Dnipro. So it's just very curious how the Ukrainians are, still conducting themselves in this sort of inhuman way, despite the conflict going on for close to 4 years now. But it's really interesting that the conflict evolution on the ground, for the first time, we're hearing the F-16s given by various European countries for the first time have been used, confirmed by the Ukrainians near Pokrovsk, in particular in the Zolotoy Kolodez, where the Russians have pushed out in this stalagmite type formation, as I said, just to the northeast of Pokrovsk. Essentially, the Russians have tried to, according to Western and again Ukrainian media sources, the Russians have tried to essentially sortie an assault force, which was promptly stopped by a huge swarm of Ukrainian drones, as well as F-16 fighter jets, which the Ukrainians have openly used. So some of this discussion that Ukrainians don't know how to fly planes yet, and I'm assuming these are Ukrainian pilots doing this, flying these Western American planes, it's already confirmed that they are using them on the front lines. So it's not just the Russians which are, dropping fab bombs on specific locations outside of Konstantinovka and other cities. But Ukrainians as well are using warplanes. So, we may be seeing essentially fighting in the air once again over some of this frontline zone, which at the moment, as you said, Conrad, it is absolutely huge. Like this particular territory just to the east of the Zaporozhye Oblast from Pokrovsk going up north to Zolotoy Kolozhets all the way to Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, the city of Siversk. The Russians have begun essentially taking that as well. And this is, of course, very close to the Kramatorsk and located right next to Svyatogorsk Monastery, which the Russians at the moment are somewhere within a 10-kilometer range of the Svyatogorsk National Park, in which this monastery, probably the biggest, and in fact, it is the biggest Orthodox Christian monastery in all of eastern Ukraine, is located in this national park. So the Russians were very close to liberating it. Of course, we spoke about last week how the caretaker of the monastery, the Metropolitan Arsenius, is currently in prison, suffering from some sort of debilitating heart conditions. And Ukrainians have incarcerated him, essentially charged him with treason, and now he's suffering in a Ukrainian prison far away from his beloved monastic brotherhood. So it's incredibly sad. So they're actually torturing him as the Russians are advancing. Most likely going to put more blame on him that the Russians are progressing through the Metropolitan's territory. Who knows what other satanic accusations they'll be throwing against him. But the front line, of course, extends all the way north of Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, to the city of Kupiansk, which the Russians have made huge progress into. And in terms of reporting on the front lines, the Russians are using, because the Russians are the advancing force, they are using heavily defended tanks, as well as these, you've probably seen them, very bizarre-looking turtle-like net and, I guess, steel-reinforced troop carriers, which, of course, the drones will smash into the steel frame, and they will, of course, not damage the vehicle inside. And they've actually shown to be quite effective. There's videos on Telegram where these particular machines are, these weird turtle-looking things are actually surviving several drone strikes and still moving, still releasing troops. So, of course, this new technological innovation by the Russians is proving to be very helpful in terms of actually saving human lives, which is quite amazing. Of course, the Russians have been shooting down Ukrainian drones, roughly 100 drones per 24 hours per day this entire week. There's been some rumors that the Ukrainians have in fact been behind the recent shutting down of external energy, electrical power to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Remember the nuclear power plant located in Energodar, that is just to the west of the Russian-controlled territories of the Zaporozhye Oblast. So this is the infamous nuclear power plant. At the beginning of the conflict, people have said, well, someone's going to strike the nuclear power plant and cause a Chernobyl 2.0, essentially a radioactive pollution wave will essentially spread across Europe once again. Fortunately enough, as of 2 days ago, as of the 10th of October, the Russians have restored at least some sort of external power to the nuclear power plant. So it is still functional. We don't have to panic, at least for now, until maybe the Ukrainians flying up the drone into the power lines and cut it off. And of course, when the nuclear power plant is cut off from external energy sourcing, it can then rely on its own internal storages, I think for about 2 to 3 weeks. So it has emergency power storage for about that long. After that, it's basically, let's just say bad things will probably happen somewhere on the Dnieper River in the Zaporozhye Oblast. And you can kind of see why the Ukrainians are striking it, because as the Russians are advancing in the Zaporozhye Oblast along the Dnieper River towards the city of Zaporozhye itself, the nuclear power plant technically is just in the Russians' rear. So it's a huge distraction, as well as potentially like a point of anxiety and pressure, because if something goes wrong on the nuclear power plant, the troops advancing through Zaporozhye on the Russian side will need to promptly evacuate from their advance. So you can kind of see this as a major factor. So obviously there's a huge incentive for the Ukrainians to cause complications on that particular end. It's very interesting in terms of like how the Russians have been conducting themselves recently. President Putin himself personally has met up with the chief commanders of the various army groups in the city of St. Petersburg, as well as, of course, the chief of staff of the entire Russian army, Valery Gerasimov himself, and Andrei Belousov, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. They met up in St. Petersburg, and there was, of course, a huge photo op. This happened on the 7th of October, so not, of course, celebrating the 2-year anniversary of the Hamas sort of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, but they were celebrating, I guess, President Putin's birthday, a 73rd birthday on the 7th of October last week. And all the leaders of the command groups, they met up in St. Petersburg. I believe they met up in one of the old Romanov halls located somewhere outside of the St. Peter's and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, because they did visit the cathedral first and they received blessings from the local priest. Maybe, I think the Bishop of St. Petersburg was present as well, the Metropolitan. And they actually, very symbolically, Putin at the St. Peter's and Paul Cathedral, this is, of course, the imperial sepulchre where all the remains of the Russian royal emperors essentially stationed in St. Petersburg. And President Putin elected to put flowers onto the grave specifically of Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar from the early 18th century, specifically onto his grave. And I think the symbolism here, Conrad, is the fact that Peter the Great is known for essentially conducting one of Russia's oldest wars between 1700 and 1721, so a 21-year war against Sweden back in the day. This is called the Northern War. And of course, one of the biggest battles between Russians and the Swedes took place where? In Ukraine, right? So just south of the Kharkovskaya Oblast, as well as east of the Sumskaya Oblast in Poltava. So pretty much right where the special military operation is taking place, the Russians and the Swedes fought at the Battle of Poltava. And of course, the Northern War being this war against, essentially a future member of NATO, Sweden, who joined NATO last year in 2024, which Russia shares a border with. This is a lot of symbolism there. So President Putin places flowers onto the grave of Peter the Great, not the other Tsars, not Paul I, not even the false relics of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, or Catherine the Great. So specifically, and then of course in the hall where they met up, there was also a huge painting in the background just behind Putin of the Tsar Peter the Great, of course, in his imperial regalia, but also wearing sort of military armor. And so Putin and the commanders are sitting at this table. With them as well is the head of the Russian FSB, of course, General Bortnikov. And they're giving reports, and this is what Putin says, they're all giving essentially numbers, statistics about the battles. Gerasimov says that the Russians have advanced into Siversk, which is just to the east of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, and the Russians have essentially almost taken all of Kupiansk as well. So everyone's very positive, and Putin makes the proclamation that in 2025, the Russians have taken 5,000 square kilometers during the special military operation zone across all the territories, which I think, Conrad, that is actually true. If many people are like, hold on, but have Russians really advanced that much in Donetsk, for example, in the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast? And it's not just those two oblasts that he's talking about. He's talking, of course, about the Sumskaya Oblast, as you said, Dnipropetrovskaya Oblast, these two other territories. And I think if you count, the Russian push out of the Kursk as well earlier this year, I think you can add up the numbers and it would roughly amount to 5,000, square kilometers that Putin has stated. So he's not making these numbers up. I think these are very well and true. And of course, the leading commanders of the South, Eastern, Northern, and Central Group were also there. Of course, all the generals. And St. Petersburg had a sort of eventful meeting where they all sort of shared their opinions and thoughts on exactly what has been taking place on the front lines. And of course, Putin has said that the Russians are making steadfast progress. The Russians are victorious and advancing, and there's no reason to sort of doubt that the objectives of the special military operation will be met. And speaking of Putin's escapades, because he's been quite busy, because following the 7th of October St. Petersburg meeting with the leaders of the Russian military, he traveled, I believe, on the 9th and then on the 10th of October to Tajikistan, to Dushanbe. And there he met with, of course, member states of CIS for a Central Asian summit. And of course, not just CIS countries, the Commonwealth of Independent State Nations, but also Azerbaijan was present. And what's interesting is Putin and Aliyev sat at this, together, and Putin gave a press conference. He was answering questions, and he, in front of Aliyev, sitting right next to him, apologized to Aliyev for the shooting down of the Azerbaijani plane that was flying from Baku to Grozny. And it was flying, of course, it was shot down over the Caspian Sea in December of 2024, if you recall, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, Russia never apologized for the shooting down of that plane. And Putin said that, look, I've just received a report 2 days ago. Turns out, yes, we shot the plane down on accident. And he said that the people responsible will be reprimanded. And he said that compensation will be paid out to Azerbaijan. And we apologize and we take full responsibility. So notice, Conrad, Putin has agreed to fully take responsibility, I suppose, on behalf of Russia for the shooting down of that plane. And look, it's been how long? 11 months. And we remember all the early attention of Azerbaijan. So clearly Putin doesn't want bad relationship with Aliyev, with the southern partners south of the Caucasus. He's clearly wanting to, and people have been saying that maybe Erdogan is the one who essentially pointed out that President Putin should apologize to Aliyev, and that there is some very interesting concessions being made by Russia. Again, I think, Conrad, we kind of need to view it strategically here. Most likely this is a mistake. Russia trying to rely on Turkey being its ally, building a nuclear power plant in the Mersin province for Turkey, trying to collaborate with Azerbaijan on energy exports to Europe, essentially masking Russian gas and oil as Azeri Baku oil and exporting that to Europe in order to bypass sanctions. Like, this is all well and good in terms of making money, but civilizationally speaking, eventually both Azerbaijan and most likely Turkey as well, and definitely Turkey, will betray Russia when the time is right. And so I suppose President Putin playing diplomat is just somewhat very normal. But he's not the only one, of course. Lavrov in Moscow actually met up with the foreign minister of the Taliban. It's very interesting seeing the Talib flag and the Russian flag at the table as the foreign minister of the Taliban of Afghanistan is sitting there across from Lavrov. And they're talking about, of course, the need to shut down the export of drugs and narcotics out of Afghanistan, and how the Taliban is working strongly against that, as well as the shutting down of terrorism in Afghanistan itself. And this is quite weird because prior to essentially in early 2025, the Taliban was still listed as a terrorist organization by the Russian Federation. So it's interesting how diplomatically, people who conduct themselves in that theater of international relations, they have to make these public, weird concessions, put themselves in uncomfortable situations. For both Putin and Lavrov, it's been a fairly eventful week. But in terms of, to summarize what's happening on the front lines, clear progress by Russia in Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, clear progress in Russia towards Siversk, Kupiansk. Everything is going basically according to plan, and in Zaporozhye as well. The Ukrainians are on the back foot, and we are seeing essentially Zelensky trying to regain the attention of Europe, as essentially the world is really focused on the Middle East again. And there's almost no guarantees that the Trump administration will continue to provide aid for Ukraine, because Trump's opinion seems to change every few months as to his position towards Ukraine. But we remember the Anchorage peace talks between Russia. Like, what is the progress on that? Well, it has completely fallen through. In fact, Umerov and Medinsky, the two spokespersons for either side, as of, I believe, last month, as of September, have stopped calling each other. They used to have weekly telephone conversations when Medinsky and Umerov would at least discuss certain points of that sort of Anchorage, Ankara discourse, or Istanbul discourse, I suppose. Now they've stopped communicating at all. So until Donald Trump, again, puts pressure on Putin and Zelensky to get back to the table, Russia and Ukraine have, the only communication they have right now is sending drones and missiles at each other. So the peace talks have completely been suspended between the two countries. That's the progress. So especially in the month of October, there's been basically no mutual communication between the two countries. And maybe for President Putin and his administration, this is a relief because Russia is making progress. It's going to gain more leverage. The longer Trump is distracted on the Middle East and focused on that particular theater of the world, the world war, the more essentially opportunity Putin will have to essentially bargain and obtain more concessions from his Western enemies when the time to sit down at the table finally does come.
No, it's true. It has been a busy few weeks for Putin and Lavrov in the diplomatic sphere. Of course, you mentioned their apparent desire to maintain connection with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Of course, they apologized to the Azeris for downing the flight. Finally, well over a year later, Putin admitted it was Russian air defense tracking Ukrainian drones, and then they apologized to the Azeris. And of course, one of the big flashpoints between Turkey and Russia is, of course, Syria. And we're getting reports that Syria, well, not necessarily HTS explicitly, but the Syrian regime, al-Shara, they want Russian peacekeepers back in Syria. Some have said that they would view them as a deterrent to Israeli advances. Others have said maybe they fear the SDF and the Kurds becoming too supported by the United States and they want the Russians there, or, who knows what reasoning they might really be thinking. But We did see clashes between the Syrian regime and the SDF this past week, but quickly a deal was signed. It's clear that the Syrian forces want none of the smoke from the SDF. They reportedly have 100,000 troops. They know that they're the only ones still enjoying the favor of the United States. So it's clear that they want to let them be. They want to let the Kurds do their own thing. ISIS is apparently being more active now in the Kurdish regions. I don't know if that's a Turkish thing or if, that's the Syrian regime escalating things. But in general, Russia, they seem to want to invite Russia back to Syria. And this all comes amidst reports that Bashar al-Assad has been hanging out in his Russian luxury, penthouse, as well as in his villa outside of Moscow, mostly just playing online video games. So I don't know what games he's specifically playing. I don't know if he's playing War Thunder. I don't know if he's playing Crusader Kings or if he's just, booting up the fort for some battle royale. But it's clear that he's not necessarily focused on reviving any kind of Alawite factions or rallying the coastal shield brigades or trying to do anything. It's clear he's sort of accepted his fate as a former king now in exile in the Third Rome. So, who knows? Maybe something will come for him. I wouldn't be surprised if there's still people that want to kill him and if he has to, have private security and whatnot. But generally speaking, it seems that the Russians, Putin and the Russian government, are interested in keeping him safe. I don't know if they have political aspirations for him or if they just want to prove to their other allied leaders that they will protect them and that you shouldn't turn on Russia just because we can't necessarily keep you in power amidst an onslaught of Israeli, Sunni, and American pressure. But unfortunately, it does seem that the Russians are still getting duped by overtures of kindness, after almost a year, months and months and months of total backstabbing by Azerbaijan, of pivoting by Turkey towards Ukraine. It just takes a few gestures and then the Russians are right back on it. So unfortunately, not enough people are prophecy pilled in the Kremlin. And that's why our show is here, right? But unless you have anything else to say about the Russo-Turkey situation, about the situation in Ukraine, Dimitri, of course, the other big front from this week is the Pakistan-Afghanistan war. Afghan forces, the Taliban, are claiming they killed up to 58 Pakistani soldiers in one of the nights of these recent border disputes. Pakistan claims they've killed, at this point, hundreds of terrorist-affiliated Taliban groups, some that have their offices in Kabul, that they claim are responsible for a lot of terror attacks in Pakistan, on the Pakistani-Afghan border. So this is effectively an ongoing war, similar to something like World War II between Pakistan and India or the 12-Day War in Iran. But the rest of the world is very hesitant to call it a war because, of course, Saudi Arabia has a mutual defense pact with Pakistan and would effectively be forced to go to war with the Taliban if this is really declared for what it is. But we have seen Pakistan shelling and completely destroying many Afghan Taliban posts on the border as well as deep into Afghanistan. The Taliban have taken a few areas within Pakistan, but there are also areas of Pakistan that were previously under Taliban control for the past several decades that then are being released claiming, we took these areas, even though they've actually been controlled by Afghanistan for a very long time. So I don't know exactly how all of the Muslim world is going to shake out in the factionalism here. I know that Saudi Arabia and many other powers, probably China and Iran even, will be calling for peace in the region, but it's clear that the Pakistanis are intent on destroying whatever these terrorists are. Of course, India sort of did the same thing to Pakistan when they started striking these specific terrorist groups that have gone into Kashmir. Pakistan is effectively doing their version of that into Afghanistan, which is, even more lawless than Pakistan, which also has a lot of issues. But we know that Imran Khan and his faction, they're much more aligned with these, Taliban-aligned groups within Pakistan that connect with the ones in Kabul. So I know you know more about the ethnic landscape of Pakistan than me, Dimitri, but unless you have anything else to say about Russia, Ukraine, I'd love to hear your perspective on this Afghan-Pakistan border conflict that, seems to, despite everyone wanting to de-escalate it, both sides seem to be continuing on.
No, of course, many have sort of not considered the fact that, the SNA and SDF clash led to the deaths of, I believe it was no military personnel, but 3 civilians on either side. That was, of course, east of Aleppo, at the Tishrin Dam on the Euphrates River. So that was a fairly big conflict, which we thought maybe escalate. However, this news from the mountains of Afghanistan and northeastern Pakistan has already taken, according to, as you said, the Pakistani military reports 200 Taliban fighters, right? Which I'll get to why that is a huge exaggeration. And at least 23 Pakistan has said 23 of its own soldiers have died and 20 have been injured. So for a country to claim that 23 of their own have been already injured, it's very interesting. That means the numbers are already, we're talking about tens of deaths at the very least. Now, the reason why I said 200 Talibani fighters have been killed is because throughout many operations of America in Afghanistan, there's been huge exaggerations. Operation Red Wings is one which many of you should go and research, when America, essentially, a group of American scouts were caught essentially, due to their own failures in an isolated position, and they claimed they held out against the Taliban, and they claimed they killed hundreds of Talibanis. There was even a Hollywood movie released with, I think it was Matt Damon playing one of the Red Wings reconnaissance American scouts. And in the movie that they killed, at least hundreds of Afghani terrorists. However, what's really curious is that in the end, turns out they probably killed maybe 10 Taliban fighters at most, because there were literally no bodies recovered. And this is just the nature of fighting in these mountains. The Taliban are so skilled, and unless these are just routine, some sort of Afghani conscripts who are not members of the actual Taliban elite force, the Pakistanis most likely will have a very hard time fighting in these mountains, of course, to the southeast of Kabul, in some of these mountainous territory zones. There is no clear border delineation between Pakistan and Afghanistan. There is no fence line. It's just mountains, hillsides. The terrain is completely inhospitable. Americans needed to train in the mountains of Colorado and other places in America in order to even obtain the necessary physiological adaptations in order to be shipped off to some of these key areas and mountainous terrains in Afghanistan during, of course, the American stay there. So the locals are trained, they've lived in these particular inhospitable zones, and to sort of consider that the Pakistanis can very easily push the Afghan Talibanis out of their disputed zones, right, somewhere on the borders, is completely, I think, bogus. A conflict like this will continue for a very long time, which is probably why, notice the Pakistanis, especially the Pashtuns, right? So Pakistan's division is very much the creation of Pakistan as a nation in and of itself, and its internal division is one of its probably biggest weaknesses as to maybe why India inevitably will be victorious over Pakistan in the future, because Pakistan is not ethnically homogenous. It is, again, because of it's a Western, essentially, settler colonial nation. It's just like a Sykes-Picot creation. Its culture is basically based around this 20th century Cold War era nationalism. Remember, Pakistan is only, I believe, a year older or a year younger than Israel is. Okay, so in terms of age, less than 80 years of age, and 39% of Pakistan is comprised of Punjabis, and these are some of the richest. These are the elites in the military, the richest folks living closer to the Indian Ocean in the south. So essentially, along the Indian border as well, in the south of the country. In the north of the country, where the fighting is taking place, the majority of the Pakistani occupants there, the natives, are actually Pashtuns, and they make up 18% of Pakistan. Now, Imran Khan, that famous, of course, cricket player, as well as Prime Minister of Pakistan, a super charismatic local leader who was, in January of 2024, imprisoned for at least 10 years, and then I think his imprisonment was even extended. He was actually a Pashtun, and he was a big supporter of Afghanistan. And 95% of the Taliban are made up of Pashtuns as well. So, in fact, in the 20th century, there was even a joint project, essentially before Pakistan was created, to create a Pashtunistan, essentially comprising of all of Afghanistan and half of Pakistan, united under majority Pashtun rulership. So, in some way, Afghanistan does have territorial aspirations onto essentially these mountainous territories of Pakistan, because they want to unite the Pashtun ethnic people into one country. And, this sort of makes sense, except for Pakistan at the moment, after, of course, the loss of Imran Khan. His imprisonment is run by essentially Punjabi, essentially, how do I describe it? Indians who've converted to Islam. And they're ruling, they see themselves as very different to the Central Asian Pashtuns, and the Punjabis are very much allied, as well, as we said, Conrad, to both Turkey, Qatar, at the same time as Saudi Arabia. So they're very much Islamic as well. Their Islam is very much Wahhabi-based, different to that of the Taliban. And they have received already, their sort of condolences. Qatar and Saudi Arabia essentially expressed deep concern of the loss of life in Pakistan. And you can kind of see, most likely, this is why Pakistan even it had that brief conflict between India and itself. Most likely there are ties, between Pakistan and certain Western interest groups, despite the fact that we sort of see Pakistan as this rogue Islamic terror supporting state, because in many cases Pakistan, frankly, is one of the leading terrorist supporting states of the late 20th century. Like, it did create essentially Al-Qaeda on its territory, the Taliban, all these other groups. Osama bin Laden freely lived on Pakistani territory for over a decade after the entire 9/11, of course, operation, right? For better or for worse, whatever people think about that, consider the fact that he lived on that borderland where the conflict now is taking place. But the other key point about this particular conflict, Conrad, is that there is actually a point of tension in the southwest of Pakistan, where there is another small ethnic group called the Balochis, and that is in the Balochistan province in Baram Chah. There is also fighting between the Pakistanis and Afghanistanis. Now, it's curious because, again, this is where the two nations meet with Iran, and Iran has, again, issues with the Balochis. This is a minority which, in and of itself, wants to gain autonomy and essentially independence from Iran. And so this entire conflict happening on the border between the two countries also puts a lot of pressure on Iran. If anything, if it expands, and if there is again, the Talibanis use some of that American equipment they took from the beginning of the Biden administration in 2021, or if you recall, the Americans, of course, leaving Afghanistan in a hurry in that sort of embarrassing and humiliating way, the Biden administration completely failing to properly wrap up the American operation and expedition in Afghanistan. If Pakistan and Afghanistan expand their conflict, this will put even more pressure on Iran to its east, because essentially that entire landscape will turn into a conflict zone, which it will need to always focus on, because there are radical Islamists both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan who hate Shia Muslims and who will, at the first opportunity, will cross the border into Iran and will conduct terror acts, as we saw during earlier bombings this year when there were suicide bombers in Iran essentially blowing up funerals and other places. So there are radicals in both of these countries, Conrad. Either nation being destabilized will lead to God knows what kind of abominable amalgamations of the Wahhabi, Salafi, Islamic types being created in either zone, like a new Taliban or a new Al-Qaeda or a new ISIS, who knows, right? And of course, ISIS Khorasan is also active in these respective zones of the world as well. So we have to keep this in mind. These are the people responsible for, allegedly the Crocus City Hall, or at least one of the parties involved, along with the Talmudic tribe involved in that particular terror act in 2024, and the eve of Purim in Russia as well. So whatever this conflict turns into, if it doesn't calm down, it'll lead to every neighboring nation, as well as like potentially all of Central Asia, being put on high alert, because both countries have this huge presence of Islamic terror. And I think that's clearly, this is orchestrated or provoked in order to destabilize the region. It's not simply a fight between two neighbors who sort of aren't getting along, because already at least 100 people have died. And this is turning into maybe even a bloodier conflict in the 5-day World War II between Pakistan and India. So it's incredibly tense.
No, it is. And again, like you mentioned, Dimitri, Pakistan-Afghan border is already one of the most lawless parts of the world. The Balochistan region, that's a civil war between a separatist group and 3 separate independent states. At this point, like you mentioned, they're one of the main levers of soft power used against the Iranians, to keep the discontinuity of the large Persian state. So a lot of these actors, a lot of these militias in these areas are going to be used by outside powers to facilitate their desire. Of course, people need to watch our George McMillan Ether Hour video episodes, because he really talks a lot about Pakistan, Afghanistan, the pipelines, the rail lines, and how a lot of these conflicts and separatist groups are influenced by China, by India, by the United States to, contribute to the great power war, the energy war, the deep energy, the sort of supply line conflict from moving energy and supplies and weapons from one part of the world to another across the world island. This is one of the main topics of our latest George McMillan episode. So check those out. Those are really, really well done. And again, video content. So people are always asking for video, but on top of the audio, you've got it right there. Of course, also That just reminds me of this week, somebody released a video version of Anthony Westgate and myself's Space is Fake podcast with full video accompaniment, basically a video presentation going along with what we are saying. So we're probably going to link all of that below. But yeah, the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict, who knows if, maybe India will see an opportunity to strike Pakistan while they're distracted on their other front. Maybe the Baluchis will escalate against both Pakistan and Iran. We're going to be watching the situation closely. But before we move on to our final church news segment, we do have to cover a few other miscellaneous news items, starting, of course, with the massive, economic news. Trump announcing, on top of the 35% tariff he already put on China, announcing anew. Now those tariffs are up to 100%. Of course, in response to that, we saw the crypto market effectively collapse for a period of time and a lot of assets get liquidated. But this morning, today, we saw Trump posting on Truth Social. He said, "Don't worry about China. It will all be fine. President Xi just had a bad moment. He doesn't want depression for his country, and neither do I. The USA wants to help China, not hurt it." And this was what he posted following a total wipeout of billions of dollars in the US stock and crypto markets after President Trump announced his tariffs. So obviously, I do support a lot of protectionism in the United States against, China and these places that have hollowed out our industry. But if we're not going to, follow through with, massive industrial policy within the United States, unfortunately, China is going to win those battles every single time. But, I don't know exactly where the crypto market stands right now. I know it recovered in a lot of ways. Still, what was it, 19 or 30 billion or something crypto assets wiped out, a lot of billions of assets in the stock market wiped out. So we don't have to spend too much time on this, Dimitri, but if you have an analysis on what really went down, let's hear it.
Yeah, of course, there was manipulation, not just a form of insider trading, but essentially in about 15 minutes, the greatest liquidation in the history of cryptocurrency essentially took place as soon as Trump made the announcement. A lot of cryptocurrency exchanges around the world, especially those relying on the Chinese exchange, this is the most popular, essentially brokerage exchange of cryptocurrency in the world, Binance, based out of China, essentially shut down. So nobody in terms of no private person or retailer or even common user of crypto could have used that 15-minute dip to purchase any cryptocurrency, because the dip was so quick and fast that none of the exchanges even registered it properly on time. And also many of the brokerage exchanges around the world, and this is one of the reasons people are saying, look, if you're going to use an exchange of one of these multinational corporations, just be aware, this is not, essentially, your cryptocurrency is not safe on these exchanges. They can crash at any point. They can stop you from buying or selling or somehow manipulating your trades if that's what you're involved in. And that's exactly what happened. In these 15 minutes, even though the price of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies fell drastically, no one could buy them at their cheap prices in that 15-minute block. So who knows who made money there? The only people who probably could have benefited is probably Chinese millionaires, billionaire whales who maybe could have purchased a dip. Those who knew, of course, again, this is classical insider trading, Nancy Pelosi style, right? Those who knew inside the Trump administration that Trump would make that announcement about China, and and then, of course, on the Chinese side, that Xi Jinping would react with the counter tariffs and essentially the counter sanctions on exports and all the other complications that would lead to the crash. And many people, of course, are people lost tens of thousands of dollars. Some people lost millions. There was a Ukrainian influencer actually who shot himself in his car in Kiev after this crash. His name was Hanich, and he was found dead in his car. Interestingly enough, and maybe as sort of in a weird, dark comedy moment, the pistol which he used to shoot himself was a ceremonial pistol given to him by the chief of the Ukrainian GUR CIA, Kirill Budanov. And why would a crypto influencer have, essentially a pistol given to him by Kirill Budanov and later, collaborating with the Ukrainian terroristic military? And then, of course, in despair, after losing probably millions of dollars in the recent market crash, he, of course, committed suicide. So this is, and he's probably not the only one. A lot of people, of course, losing many assets, fall into great despair and depression. In any case, this particular crash, Conrad, all it shows us is that the huge billionaires in, be it the US or China, they still hold the reins on cryptocurrency. It's not completely decentralized, so to speak. Yes, Bitcoin only dipped a relatively small amount, but the smaller coins absolutely are controlled by larger interest holders around the world who, unfortunately, this just shows that cryptocurrency is not exactly decentralized. And, you have to be very careful as to where you invest. And I'm not, not exactly not against cryptocurrency at all, but be very careful. Know that you're essentially playing against people who are essentially in positions of almost like regime change level power in the world, who will move your coin up or down in price at a whim or at a moment's notice as soon as Xi Jinping or Trump make a certain press conference statement.
Very, very true. Solid advice there at the end. And regarding, Trump and Xi's relationship, Trump, of course, is trying to get Xi to meet with him soon. He says he doesn't know if Xi still wants to meet. This whole trade war thing is, that's the thing that China takes the most seriously. They seem to take it almost more seriously than actual, U.S. interference in Taiwan. However, this is from Dave DeCamp. Coalition urges Trump to reverse U.S. shift away from strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. A group of 15 national organizations from across the political spectrum are urging President Trump to reduce military tensions with China by reversing the U.S. shift away from the policy of strategic ambiguity concerning Taiwan and reaffirming the One China policy as he engages with Beijing on trade negotiations. For decades, the One China framework, recognizing the PRC as the sole legal government of China while maintaining robust informal ties with Taiwan, helped prevent war in the Taiwan Strait. The coalition, which includes antiwar.com, said in a letter to the president. The letter points to shifts away from the policy over the years, including President Biden's repeated pledges to defend Taiwan if China attacks, and then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taipei in 2022. It also points to the current Trump administration's claims that China poses an imminent threat to Taiwan and the deployment of new missile systems to Japan. These steps may be described by some in Washington as deterrents, but in practice, they heighten a classic security dilemma. Each side's moves to ostensibly prevent war look like preparations for war to the other, spurring further militarization and hardening positions at the bargaining table as well as in the Strait. Obviously, Trump, we have even seen shifts on the State Department website where it was very clear before and marked that China is the legitimate government of Taiwan, that America abides by the One China policy. Trump has, like this article says, moved to strategic ambiguity on that front and sort of left the door open to fully supporting open Chinese independence, whether it's through a referendum or for an actual armed conflict that then leads to the ROC emerging as a actually independent state, not one just recognized by 23 countries or something recognize Taiwan as independent, and most of them are irrelevant countries in the South Pacific. But regardless, it's clear that eventually the Taiwan position of the U.S. is going to come to the fore when it comes to future U.S.-China negotiations and clashes, because it's clear that Trump himself is of the mind that he wants to decouple from the entanglements in the Middle East and even in Ukraine and shift over to China. But the question is, will that wing of the State Department and the Pentagon win out as well? But moving away briefly from China before, again, we move on to church news, one of the bigger pieces of news this week. This was from Moldova. It's from Rerum Novarum. Moldova's authorities present their reintegration plan for the breakaway region of Pridnestrovia. Many know it as Transnistria. The plan aims to reintegrate Tiraspol with the rest of the country by 2027, with Chisinau hoping to join the EU by 2028. And of course, this is happening because, technically speaking, according to European Union rules, a country involved in a separatist dispute that doesn't have full control over all of its territory that it claims within its state borders is not eligible for European Union integration. Of course, that can easily be disregarded because Cyprus is part of the European Union and doesn't control over 30% of its claimed territory in the Republic of Cyprus. Of course, that's controlled by the unrecognized Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is recognized by nobody besides Turkey. And Pridnestrovia isn't even recognized by its supporters in Russia. So in theory, it could be quite easy for Moldova to be allowed into the European Union without Pridnestrovian integration. However, it's clear that the Moldovan authorities in Chisinau view it as important to signal that they are very serious about disempowering the Pridnestrovian and Moldavian Republic, disempowering the Transnistrians, disempowering whatever Russian influence is there. And of course, some articles from any European Zog source all reference the fact that the person who might be the one that really needs to make the decision on this is Viktor Gushon, who is, of course, the CEO of the Sheriff Corporation, which controls over 60% of the economy in the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic. And it is sort of up to him whether or not they should integrate. Of course, the Russians had to find intermediaries to supply the PMR with oil in the midst of the huge oil shutdown with Gazprom in Moldova, where they weren't able to continue providing the region with any electricity. So there were huge rationings and blackouts. But now, at least when I was there, it appeared to be less bad. Tiraspol is a beautiful city, as I mentioned before. I posted a bit about it on my X account. Much nicer than Chisinau. So I would encourage, people say it's this, total kleptarchy controlled by Gushan and the Sheriff Corporation. So what if it is? Frankly, it's nicer than the rest of Moldova. So I would keep doing what you're doing. And of course, in our previous episode, we discussed the restrictions on voting in the latest Moldovan elections. How many of the people in Pridnestrovia, was it only 12,000 of them actually voted? So it was clear that either they were boycotting the election or they were restricted in some capacity or threatened. Of course, ongoing investigations and people are still looking at what really happened. But I can confidently say that I don't believe 50.1% of Moldova supports Maya Sandu or any of her nonsense. So I'm confident in calling those elections garbage. But of course, I'm sure you have some church news, Dimitri. One of the most unfortunate developments the past week we saw was the double attack on the Pochai of Lavra, the SBU's search, and Ukrainian nationalists attempted a seizure in the same day. This is from the Union of Orthodox Journalists. It says on October 8th, unknown individuals attempted to seize the monastery's administrative building. The attackers cut through locks on the gates with an angle grinder and attempted to penetrate the inside. However, a group of seminarians responded quickly and managed to prevent the breakthrough and to push the attackers back outside the gates. The attackers left but threatened to return with reinforcements. Eyewitnesses report that the attackers included the head of the Kremenets division of the SBU, Sergei Zasyadko, as well as the head of the state-run Kremenets Pochayev Preserve, Vasily Ilchishin. So there's this big collaboration in Ukraine between these civilian nationalist groups, that allied themselves with the schismatics, and then the SBU and the Ukrainian military themselves. And of course, Pochayev Lavra, it's the second most important monastery in all of Ukraine after the Kiev caves. Like you mentioned, Dmitry, Svyatogorsk Monastery, thank goodness, hopefully will be behind the front lines and forever in the Russian world soon. We can pray that happens with minimal damage to the monastery and that the Ukrainians don't, on their way out and retreat, burn it down or kill anybody like they are known to do. I saw many churches in the Donetsk People's Republic where Ukrainians used to occupy that they burned as they retreated because they basically were doing a full scorched earth, didn't want the Russians to have to rebuild from scratch civilization there, because fundamentally the Ukrainians do not care about the Orthodox Church. And I have some interviews with refugees from Chasiv Yar that we are translating. I'll be releasing soon, talking about exactly what the Ukrainians did to their parish church when they came to town, shooting icons, destroying relics and things. So horrible, horrible things from these satanic people. But if you have anything else to say about the Pochayev situation, Dmitry, I'd love to hear it, because the Ukrainians also, unfortunately, recently seized the Volyn Cathedral and Seminary building from the canonical church in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. It was very disgusting, actually, to see those metal cutters essentially try to open up those doors of the Pochayev monastery. And it's thankful, that these Ukrainian nationalists, these scoundrels, these hooligans, were stopped by both the seminarians and the monks, and essentially Orthodox Christians who are not yet sent to the front lines by the Ukrainian terroristic regime, those still actively defending the monastery, actually did so, right? Because it's rare. All the other monasteries, mostly in central Ukraine, like in Cherkasy or the big cathedrals there, a lot of the actual men of, say, fighting age have actually already been either kidnapped or forcefully recruited or enlisted into the Ukrainian military, and they're not actually there actively able to protect some of those churches like the Archangel Michael Cathedral, which we all saw footage of, the capture of that in the Oblast of Cherkasy in Ukraine last year. So this is all explicit, all very sort of explicit persecution that the Ukrainian regime has been carrying out. But this is a new wave of it. And we recall, I believe it was earlier this year when the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine essentially announced that it has a big interest in the relics of the monks in the Pochayev Lavra itself. Of course, the reliquary of the monks in Pochayev is a lot smaller than that of the Kiev-Pechersk caves, but at the moment, as we know, these 70 or so plus relics of the Kiev Lavra caves are now being investigated by Ukrainian scientists. They're taking DNA samples, taking pieces of the relics and looking at them under microscopes and all kinds of disgusting other things, completely taken out of the care of the Orthodox Christians and the Orthodox Christian Church of Ukraine. So there's a desecration happening in Kiev, and they would love to do the same somewhere in the laboratory in Lvov. The reason I say Lvov is because Pochayev Lavra is, if I'm not mistaken, located exactly 140 kilometers east of Lvov. So when people say, well, maybe the city of Lvov should go to Poland, which is like a NATO state, or Hungary, or should be given over to a country like Romania or some other non-Russian entity, I have to ask them, would you like the Pochayev Lavra also to go to a NATO-run country so that, that potentially the Orthodox Christians there could be persecuted or pressured or Latinized in some way like they were in the past. Pachayev Lavra, for reference, by the way, and you can find video evidence of this on YouTube, for example, on some very old videos, 15 years plus in age. And I don't recommend anyone watch them either, but Pachayev Lavra is famous for some of the monastic elders there carrying out exorcisms of demons in particular. So many people in Western Ukraine, if possessed by demonic entities, would go to the Pachayev Lavra monastery for grace and for spiritual assistance against these ailments. And some of these exorcisms are filmed, especially essentially from inside of the Pachayev monastery, by some of the monks in order to show people just how dangerous demonic possession is. And the Pachayev Theotokos icon especially has, great power in terms of God's grace at expelling a lot of these demonic entities. So in many ways, Conrad, we can almost see the attacks on the Pachayev Monastery Lavra, its churches, its relics, and its monastic community as an attack against essentially one of the great bulwarks of those who stand up against demonic entities in the spiritual realm, because it is one of those like bastions of Christianity in Western Ukraine, as you said, second most important monastery. So we have to keep that aspect in mind. Most likely this is why the Bolsheviks and the communists shut down Orthodox Christian monasteries around the USSR. And by the time the Second World War kicked off between the Third Reich and the USSR, not a single monastery was left open in Belarus, Ukraine, or mainland Russia or Central Asia. Keep that in mind when Operation Barbarossa commenced. So the shutting down of monasteries is a signature move of not just a Talmudic tribe, but any satanic group which seeks to undermine Christianity in a certain given land which it occupies. So this is exactly what we're seeing. And correctly put, Conrad, I think we'll probably see more incursions on the Pachayev Lavra into the future as long as this Ukrainian regime remains in power. And the other cathedral, which has now been confirmed to be occupied by the Ukraine, most likely we'll see Sergei Epifany Dymenko, the false Metropolitan of Kiev, serve a liturgy there very soon. This is the Dormition Cathedral of Vladimir Volinsky. So this is in the Volyn diocese next to Lvov, again, Western Ukraine, very far away from Kiev, far away from the Donbass, far away from any Russian territories, really. If any close pro-Russian territories nearby, it's most likely Belarus, right? So, maybe Batska Lukashenko could, help us out in the near future and try to liberate some of these Orthodox Christian zones. But the Vladimir Cathedral, the Dormition Cathedral of the Theotokos, has officially been taken over. The Metropolitan of Volyn, Vladimir, again, interestingly, the Metropolitan of Vladimir is also named Vladimir. He put out a video response with all of his other auxiliary bishops and high clergymen, archpriests, where they've stated that at the moment they are seeking an appeal at the local courts in order for the Ukrainian authorities to give them back this cathedral. Now, mind you, this cathedral is over 1,000 years old, literally built by, according to record, built by Vladimir Monomach, the Vladimir II, Saint Vladimir as well, in 1156 AD, so very, very old. And it was essentially, this is the same, despite the fact that the cathedral looks relatively new, the foundation, its walls, the majority of the cathedral is actually from that age, 900 or so years ago. It was destroyed by Batu Khan, the Mongols. It was destroyed in a series of fires throughout the 15 and the 1600s. However, it was constantly renovated, rebuilt, and it stands to this day in this beautiful teal/aqua color in the western regions of Malorussia, in Volyn, these westernmost provinces of historical Rus, and essentially the western parts of the Russian world. And unfortunately, this huge cathedral, one of the biggest cathedrals of Western Ukraine, is now under complete occupation. So that's quite harrowing, I think. What's notable as well is Sergei Dymenko, this false metropolitan. What has he been doing, right? As the cathedral and the Pachayev Lavra raids have been taking place, well, he visited actually Mount Athos. So he was given an audience at Pantokrator Monastery on Mount Athos. And at the Pantokratoros Monastery, when he served the liturgy there, I believe it was on the 9th or 10th of October, you can see that almost none of the Greek Athonite monks showed up to the liturgy. The church was empty. So, kudos to the Orthodox Christian Greek Athonite monks at the Pantokrator Monastery for not giving an audience, despite the fact that the archimandrite of the monastery invited this wolf in sheep's clothing, a literal layperson in bishop's robes to serve a liturgy at this church. The other monks, of course, they knew better. So the Holy Spirit well and truly is working there. And the other monastery which Demenko visited, among specifically was, of course, the Esphigmenou, the new monastery, where the archimandrite of the new Esphigmenou monastery made a very interesting remark where he was mentioning, of course, the Esphigmenou monastery, old calendars. He said, the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine are very similar to the old calendarist radical zealots when they invaded Ukraine. We are dealing with the same enemies, me and you, Metropolitan Epiphany Demenko. And I'm like, well, I suppose it's kind of true. Yeah, Russians are very conservative. They're not quite zealots, not just yet, but interesting, analogy that the archimandrite was making there. So
that's a hilarious comment because he's right in the sense that, look, I don't support the schismatics in Esphigmenou, but I certainly don't support the goobers of new Esphigmenou either. And, just because you disagree with the zealots, you can't deny that they were there first. Like, they've been the people that have been always in the monastery. They're the ones that the EP has threatened to sick the Greek police on. They're the ones that, defended their offices in Kharkiv with Molotov cocktails. So, much like the people in the Donbass and Donetsk and Lugansk, started defending themselves in 2014. It's a similar situation. So, yeah, he's exactly right. He just didn't make the point that I think that he wanted to.
It's a complete failure. And also, how embarrassing for him inviting a layperson who was literally this guy is not a bishop at all and just trying to make some sort of geopolitical statement. It's just completely inappropriate. So the other big debate in Ukraine at the moment, this is quite interesting, but you can also see the pressure being put on the bishops. And so this is quite a commentary, actually. So Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, the essentially a confessor of Orthodox Christianity at this point, we can actively say that. He gave a recent sort of video address in which he said that, that council that took place on the 27th of May in the Theophania district of Kiev in 2022. So at the beginning of the SMO, only 2 months into the special military operation, there was a council which essentially Metropolitan Onufry and the majority of the Ukrainian bishops proclaimed a semi-autocephalous status of the Ukrainian Autonomous Church. So they basically said that, look, you don't have to pray for Patriarch Kirill, you don't have to pray for the Moscow Patriarchate officially in the liturgy or other services, and we're also going to be consecrating and essentially making our own myrrh, right, our own chrism. And this was a big breakaway from, of course, to Christian sort of tradition in a way. And of course, Metropolitan Theodosius said that this particular council in Theophania on the 27th of May 2022 was essentially somewhat illegitimate. He said that the Ukrainian state applied pressure. So he said the Ukrainian feds worked to put pressure on Metropolitan Onufry and the other bishops in order to make this semi-autocephalous thing work. And of course, autocephaly for the canonical Church of Ukraine will be a grievous sort of error. And he again spoke out against that. But many other bishops across Ukraine also responded over the internet, including Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, who normally we would, and he is to this day, he is also a confessor of the faith. He is currently located in the city of Zaporozhye itself. Remember, he moved from Melitopol, the Russian capital of Zaporozhye, to the Ukrainian capital of Zaporozhye, risking imprisonment just to be with his flock. So we can never, call him a coward. But interestingly, he did mention in a sermon responding to Metropolitan Theodosius that he said that he doesn't believe Ukrainian feds applied any pressure onto the Ukrainian hierarchs at the beginning of the SMO to make anti-Russian, decisions. So there's a kind of a big split of opinion that you see even those sort of stalwart, foundationally conservative, very based bishops like Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye give these, I don't want to say concessions, but I guess he gave his opinion during the sermon that Metropolitan Theodosius was wrong. In any case, we don't see Metropolitan Onufry making any comments at the moment. I think he's struggling to essentially address these various pinpoints of persecution around his entire autonomous church, which is governing him and his synod. So we can't really apply any sort of media pressure, God forbid, on any of those bishops suffering persecution in Ukraine at the moment. We're just commenting on it from a news perspective. And also, this is an example of exactly what happens. This is how the interaction between bishops is made difficult in a state of psychological, media, statewide persecution when it hasn't reached the sort of equivalents of what happened in Russia in, say, 1937, 38, but this is maybe 1926, 27. If you know the timeline of Soviet persecution, when the Soviet state was putting pressure on the Orthodox Church, and many Orthodox bishops essentially broke rank, many of them caved in, and many of them changed their positions in order to appease the Soviet state more, maybe trying to seek compromises in order to assist their own flock. And I'm not saying Metropolitan Luke is doing that. It's just this is what happens under a state of persecution. There is a lot of testing happening. And I think Zelensky's administration, despite the fact that none of them are technically Orthodox Christian by faith, many of them are literally members of the Talmudic synagogue of Satan, they know exactly who they're dealing with. They know who their enemy is, and they know that the more pressure they apply in the church, the more weaknesses will come out internally from its members, because the church is, of course, a hospital. So very key news. And of course, we'll always keep sort of talking about the subject of hypothetical autocephaly, because God forbid, as per the prophecies of Elder Zosima, no one in the canonical church of Ukraine should be announcing or proclaiming autocephaly, because that will be potentially inciting a new schism equivalent to that of the false patriarch Filaret of Kiev or the false metropolitan Sergei Dumenko Epiphany, etc. So, we have to stick to what the saints of Ukraine, Malorussia, Novorossiya have taught us over the last 100 years. Elder Jonah of Odessa, Elder Zosima, and of course, Saint of the Donbass of Donetsk, and of course, Saint Lawrence of Chernigov, these three foundational saints of the last 100 years of this land. All of them unequivocally have stated that Ukraine should not be autocephalous and separated from the Moscow Patriarchate, from the mother church in Russia. And, I think the reasonable hierarchs will understand that. So we have to keep them in our prayers so that they retain their sort of soberness and they can withstand all this persecution and pressure.
No, we have to pray for the bishops, the long-suffering, the people. I mean, just think, these are regular seminarians at Pochayev that had to, basically resort to some form of, moderate violence to defend themselves. And this is a whole nation of, a lot of confessors at the lay level, at the monastic level, at the presbyterial and episcopal levels. So we really need to keep the long-suffering Ukraine in our prayers. Of course, we're here at about 2 hours, so we are coming to the end of our program. Thank you all so much for tuning in to the very end. I want to make sure everybody prepares. I will be releasing a lot of content this week and then the coming weeks. Expect an interview with the Alexander Nevsky Volunteer Brigade on the front lines somewhere in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions of the Russian Federation fighting against the Ukrainians. I asked them a lot of questions about their religion, how they practice the faith on the front, and a lot of other interesting questions. So be sure to stay tuned for that. We've also got the Gabriel Doroshin interview cooking up with subtitles. So prepare for all of that. This stuff, I believe it's going to be released to paywall subscribers first. And then after a few weeks, we're going to throw it out for everybody. And I don't mean, months. It will probably be 2.5, 3 weeks, and then we will make it free for everybody. But if you want to see it right when it drops, be sure to get behind the paywall, worldwarnow.co. That's how you can support the show. We've got a lot of other premium content. Dimitri and I are probably going to comment on all the interviews, give my director's commentary on the context and how the interviews came about. Dimitri wants to discuss a lot of things. We're going to be discussing Gabriel Doroshin's background, more of the details about his lineage and whatnot, stuff that we couldn't get to in the interview that I was able to do with him. So stay tuned for all of that. Get behind the paywall to immediately get all of that into your inbox. And of course, it supports the show. When I do this travel, when we have a bit of a reduction in episodes, we always lose some subscribers. So please consider becoming a ether-pilled patriot. We're listening to all the Ether Hour episodes. You don't just get access to all of the episodes. You also get access to our Q&A threads, which I believe after I release most of this Donbass content, we will immediately be throwing out another question and answer thread for our subscribers to do another Q&A episode. So really looking forward to that. You can ask us whatever you want, and we will answer it in long form in a Ether Hour episode just for you. You also get access to paid subscriber only Discord channels where I release a lot of stuff that hasn't been put out yet and give hints and talk a lot more about what's really going on behind the scenes with the paid subscribers. So be sure to check all of that out again, worldwarnow.co, just $7 a month or even less if you pay for the whole year. So it's really, really helps us. And you get access to, at this point, hundreds and hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content. So thank you all for tuning in here to the very end. You can follow us on Twitter or X at World War Now _. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. If you just search World War Now, I should be back to the weekly World War live streams this week, hopefully. So stay tuned for all of that. Got a lot to discuss, obviously. It's been too long. So I'm looking forward to that. You can find me on X at GnomeRad. You can find Dimitri on X at WWN Host. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much wherever podcasts are found. But again, our home base, worldwarnow.co. It's that Substack. Get the Substack app. It's a great way to listen to the show as well. So again, thank you all so much for listening here to the very end. And Dimitri, I will leave you with the last word.
Of course, just to mirror what Conrad said, thank you everyone for your support. The least you can do is like the video, retweet, share it. And of course, if you really want to add to our content, me and Conrad, the stuff we produce and the great content we have coming up for you, subscribe on Substack. Thank you all for listening. We have some amazing footage coming out for you this week. So stay tuned. Keep us in your prayers. God bless.